Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's worst career decisions, becoming a medieval outlaw. No safety net, no rights, no backup plan, just you, the forest, and a growing number of people who would like to see you removed from existence as efficiently as possible. What could possibly go wrong? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see who's here, voluntarily. Why you wouldn't last a day as a medieval outlaw. It begins with something small, not dramatic, not cinematic. No thunder, no ominous music, no wise narrator warning you to make better life choices. Just a moment, quick, unimpressive, where things quietly go wrong. Maybe you fail to pay a tax, not out of rebellion, just because you're poor, which inconveniently is not considered a valid excuse. Maybe you argue with a local official who has the emotional stability of wet bread. Maybe you accidentally offend a noble, which in medieval society is less of a social mistake and more of a highly efficient way to delete your future. And then, just like that, it happens. You are declared an outlaw. Now, the word sounds impressive, almost heroic, like you've rejected society and embraced freedom, like you're about to live your best rebellious life in the woods, possibly with a dramatic cloak and excellent posture. You are not. What actually happens is much simpler. Society deletes you. You haven't escaped the law. The law has simply stopped caring what happens to you, which, as it turns out, is significantly worse. From this moment on, you are no longer protected. Not by courts, not by guards, not even by basic human decency. If someone robs you, that's unfortunate. If someone beats you, that's their personal hobby. If someone kills you, well, congratulations. You've become a solution. You are no longer a person. You are an inconvenience with legs. And the change is immediate. People who once knew you suddenly become very interested in not knowing you. The baker avoids eye contact. The neighbor who used to greet you now studies the ground like it contains philosophical answers. Doors close faster. Conversations end mid-sentence. You don't just lose safety. You lose existence. Helping you is dangerous. Being seen with you is dangerous. Even acknowledging you becomes the medieval equivalent of bad career planning. And here's where it gets worse. There's no appeal. No retrial. No, let's hear your side of the story. Medieval justice is not a discussion. It's a decision, usually made by someone with more power than patience. And you've just been removed from the system entirely, which sounds manageable until you realize something very important. You are completely unprepared for this. Your entire life has been built inside structure. Even if it was harsh, it still gave you rules, expectations, and a place to exist without being actively hunted. Now all of that is gone. And in its place, you have uncertainty, exposure, and a rapidly growing list of people who would benefit from your absence. Which is a polite way of saying, you've made it about 5 minutes, and things are already not going well. Because the most dangerous part of being an outlaw isn't the law, it's everyone else. You might assume the real threat comes from armored guards or mounted patrols, men with authority, weapons, and a professional interest in your capture. And yes, they are a problem. A large, well-equipped problem. But they are not the only problem. The baker is a problem. The farmer is a problem. The old man sitting outside doing absolutely nothing is somehow also a problem. Because now every single person you encounter has two options. Ignore you, or benefit from reporting you. And medieval society loves incentives. Rewards for capturing or exposing outlaws were not uncommon. Even without money, there's social gain. Loyalty to a lord, proof of obedience, or simply the comfort of knowing you've removed a threat from your community. You are no longer a neighbor. You are an opportunity. So that friendly nod you used to exchange with the baker, gone. Now he's watching you like you're a suspicious stain on his floor. The farmer who once sold you food? He's gripping a tool with a new sense of purpose. Even children, who normally specialize in chaos and poor decisions, understand one thing very clearly. Stay away from you, and if they don't, their parents will correct that mistake immediately. You begin to notice something unsettling. It's not just that people fear you. They've already decided what you are. Dangerous. Untrustworthy. Disposable. And once people agree on a story like that, they tend to stick with it. Which means every movement you make has consequences. Walking into a village is no longer casual. It's a calculated risk. Staying visible too long invites attention. Acting nervous makes you suspicious. Acting calm makes you suspicious. In fact, everything you do is suspicious. You are essentially a walking red flag in a time period that does not appreciate flags. And the worst part? You can't fix it. There's no conversation that clears your name. No explanation that changes their minds. You don't get to rebrand yourself as misunderstood. Medieval people don't do rebranding. They do conclusions, fast ones. So you adapt. You avoid people. You move quietly. You keep your distance. You start seeing others not as potential help, but as potential danger. Because that's exactly what they are. And just like that, in less than a day, you've learned your first real rule of survival. The moment you became an outlaw, the world didn't just turn against you. It became very interested in watching you fail. By the time the sun begins to sink, you're already tired. Not the comfortable kind of tired that comes with a bed waiting for you. This is a different kind. The kind that sits behind your eyes, mixed with hunger, tension, and the slow realization that you no longer have anywhere to go. Because night is coming. And night, for you, is no longer something you experience indoors. You start looking for a place to rest. Not a good place. Those no longer exist. But a place that is hidden, quiet, and hopefully not already occupied by something with teeth. A cluster of trees. A ditch. The ruins of something abandoned long ago. Anywhere that makes you slightly less visible than standing in the open like a poorly thought-out decision. You settle on the ground. Immediately, you notice two things. First, it's colder than expected. The kind of cold that seeps in slowly. As if the earth itself is reminding you that comfort was a privilege you used to have. Second, the ground is not flat. Not even slightly. It's uneven, damp, and strategically designed to make every position uncomfortable. You lie down anyway, because exhaustion doesn't negotiate. The sounds begin almost immediately. Leaves shifting, branches cracking, something moving in the distance. Normally, these would be background noise. The kind of thing your mind filters out without effort. Now, every sound matters. Because every sound could be someone finding you. You try to relax. It doesn't work. Your body stays tense. Your breathing shallow. Your thoughts moving faster than they should. Sleep becomes less about rest, and more about briefly losing consciousness, while hoping nothing terrible happens in the meantime. And then there are the smaller inconveniences. Insects. Persistent, enthusiastic insects. They crawl, buzz, and remind you that you are not alone, just not in a comforting way. You try to ignore them. You fail. Time passes slowly. You drift in and out of sleep, never fully resting, always half aware. Every shift in position wakes you. Every noise pulls you back to alertness. Your body wants rest, but your situation refuses to allow it. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a thought settles in. This is just the first night. No improvement is scheduled. No upgrade is coming. There is no getting used to it that magically turns this into something manageable. This is the baseline now. And as the cold deepens and the darkness stretches on, you begin to understand something very clearly. You didn't just lose your home. You lost the ability to feel safe. Even when you're doing nothing at all. Morning arrives without ceremony. No warm light gently waking you. No breakfast waiting. No comforting routine to pretend life is still normal. Just cold air, a stiff body, and the immediate, unmistakable realization that you are hungry. Not mildly hungry. Not I'll grab something later hungry. This is deeper. Sharper. The kind of hunger that doesn't politely wait its turn. It pushes itself into every thought, every decision, every movement. Because now food is not part of your day. It is your entire day. You can't walk into a market. You can't sit at a table. You can't casually exchange coins for something edible. That version of life ended yesterday, along with your legal existence. So your options are limited. You start searching, slowly at first, then with more urgency. You look for anything. Berries, roots, something growing that doesn't immediately look like it wants revenge. You hesitate before eating anything unfamiliar, which is wise, because medieval plants tend to fall into two categories. Barely edible or deeply regrettable. If you're lucky, you find something small. If you're unlucky, you learn the hard way that not everything green is your friend. At some point, the idea crosses your mind. You could steal a farm, a chicken, maybe something left unattended for just a moment. It sounds simple in theory. In practice, it involves approaching a place full of people who already consider you a problem, taking something they need, and then leaving quickly enough to avoid consequences, which, as strategies go, is ambitious. Even if you succeed, it doesn't last. One meal doesn't solve anything. It just resets the clock, and hunger returns quickly. Your body begins to change its priorities. Energy drops. Movements slow. Thoughts become less clear, more focused on immediate survival. Long-term plans? Gone. Strategy? Optional. The only thing that matters is the next meal, and the next, and the next. And here's the part no one tells you. Hunger makes everything harder. Running becomes slower. Hiding becomes less effective. Thinking becomes questionable. You start taking risks you wouldn't normally take, simply because your body is pushing you to act, which is exactly when mistakes happen. And mistakes, in your situation, are not minor inconveniences. They are endings. So you keep searching, keep moving, keep hoping to find just enough to continue. Because in this life, survival isn't about thriving. It's about not stopping. And hunger is doing everything it can to make sure you do. By now, you've probably convinced yourself of something comforting. That the forest is your refuge, your ally, your quiet, protective shield from the world that wants you gone. This is unfortunately a misunderstanding. The forest is not your friend. It is simply a place where problems are less organized. At first glance, it seems ideal. Dense trees, natural cover, fewer people. You can disappear here, or at least pretend to. But the longer you stay, the more you realize something important. You're not hiding in the forest. You're surviving inside it. And the forest has its own rules. The ground is rarely dry. Even when it looks dry, it isn't. Moisture lingers, seeping through your clothes, settling into your bones, slowly turning discomfort into something more permanent. Walking becomes harder. Resting becomes colder. Everything feels just slightly worse than it should. Then there's navigation. Paths are unreliable. Landmarks repeat themselves. One cluster of trees looks very much like the last cluster of trees, which looked suspiciously like the one before that. You try to keep track of where you are, but the forest has a way of gently erasing your confidence. You don't get lost all at once. You just slowly stop being sure. And while you're figuring that out, the forest continues doing what it does best, being completely indifferent to your existence. Food is scarce. Not non-existent, just unreliable. You might find something one day and nothing the next. Hunting requires skill, patience, and energy. 3 things you are rapidly running low on. Gathering is safer, but even that becomes unpredictable. And then there are the sounds, not the dramatic kind. Not wolves howling every 5 minutes like a badly written story. No, it's quieter than that. Subtle movements, rustling leaves, something shifting just out of sight. Enough to remind you that you are not alone, but not enough to tell you what you're sharing the space with. You start to realize something uncomfortable. The forest isn't protecting you from danger. It's just introducing you to a different kind of it. And unlike the villages and roads you've left behind, this danger doesn't think. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't negotiate. It simply exists. Which means your survival here depends entirely on you, your awareness, your endurance, your ability to keep going, even when everything around you quietly suggests that maybe you shouldn't. And as the hours pass and the trees stretch endlessly in every direction, one thought becomes harder to ignore. This place isn't a refuge. It's just where you haven't been caught. Yet. By now you've learned a few things. The ground is uncomfortable. Food is unreliable. The forest is not your ally. And most importantly, being seen is a problem. Which leads you to your next unpleasant realization. You cannot stay in one place. Even if you find a spot that feels almost safe, a hidden clearing, a sheltered corner, somewhere that doesn't immediately try to ruin your day, it won't stay safe for long. Because safety, in your situation, expires quickly. All it takes is one person, one glimpse, one moment where someone notices movement where there shouldn't be any. Maybe they don't act immediately. Maybe they walk away. But they remember. And memory, in medieval society, spreads faster than you do when you're tired and underfed. So you move, not because you want to, but because you have to. You leave behind places just as you begin to understand them. You abandon routes just as they start to feel familiar. Every step forward erases any sense of stability you might have built. You don't settle, you drift. And drifting comes at a cost. Your body is already strained. Hunger is constant. Sleep has been questionable at best. Now add movement. Continuous, necessary, exhausting movement. And things start to wear down quickly. Your legs ache. Your pace slows. Small distances begin to feel longer. You start choosing paths not because they're safe, but because they're manageable, which is exactly how bad decisions begin. Because exhaustion changes how you think. You stop planning ahead. You focus on the immediate. The next step, the next place to rest, the next moment of relief. Long-term survival becomes a distant concept, something you'll deal with later, assuming there is a later. And while you're dealing with all of this, the world doesn't pause. People are still out there. Roads are still being used. Patrols still exist. Villagers are still watching their surroundings. You are not moving through an empty landscape. You are moving through a world that does not want you in it. And every time you stop, you risk becoming visible. Every time you slow down, you risk being found. So you keep going, even when your body tells you to stop. Even when your mind starts to blur the line between caution and desperation. even when the idea of just sitting still for a while feels dangerously appealing, because stillness for you is no longer rest, it's exposure. And exposure is how this ends. At some point, exhaustion begins to whisper something very reasonable. You shouldn't be doing this alone. It sounds logical, sensible even. Humans are not designed to survive in isolation, especially not in conditions where everything is actively trying to make survival inconvenient. So naturally, the idea forms: find others, other outlaws, other fugitives, people who understand what this is like, and eventually, you do. A figure in the distance, movement that isn't random, someone who doesn't look surprised to see you, which is already unsettling. There's a moment of hesitation, the silent exchange of two people calculating risk faster than trust can form. Then, cautiously, you don't run, which is your first mistake, or possibly your least bad option. Because what follows is not friendship, it's negotiation. You might share a fire, you might exchange information, maybe even food, if either of you has any, which would be a rare and deeply suspicious occurrence. For a brief moment, it feels almost manageable, like you've found some version of stability in a life that offers none. But here's the problem. Survival changes people. Trust is no longer a virtue. It's a gamble. Every person you meet has the same goal as you, to stay alive. And when resources are limited, which they always are, that goal tends to become very personal, very quickly. If food runs low, sharing becomes optional. If danger appears, loyalty becomes flexible. If there's a chance to improve their situation at your expense, well, you're already seeing the pattern. You start watching them, not out of paranoia but necessity. You notice how they move, what they say, what they don't say. Every action becomes something to interpret. Every silence becomes something to question. And the worst part? They're doing the exact same thing to you. There are no secrets here. No privacy. No comfortable assumptions. Just two or more people, each quietly aware that cooperation lasts only as long as it remains useful. And when it stops being useful, so does the relationship. This isn't a band of loyal companions like in the stories. There's no shared cause, no noble mission holding everyone together. There's only circumstance, temporary, fragile, and always at risk of breaking. Eventually, something shifts. It could be small, a disagreement, a suspicion, a moment where one of you hesitates just a little too long, and suddenly the understanding is gone. You don't need words to recognize it. Trust didn't fail. It was never really there to begin with. And as you move on, alone again, or perhaps just pretending to be, one thought settles in quietly. In this life, other people aren't your safety. They're just another variable you can't control. Up to this point, survival has been difficult, uncomfortable, exhausting, and deeply inconvenient, but still possible. Then something small happens. You slip. It's not dramatic. There's no heroic fall, no slow-motion moment where you reflect on your life choices. Just a misstep. A wet patch of ground, a loose stone, a branch that doesn't hold your weight the way you expected. You fall, and suddenly everything changes. Because in your old life, this would be nothing, a minor annoyance. You'd stand up, brush yourself off, maybe complain briefly, then continue with your day, like a person who expects tomorrow to exist. Now it matters. You check yourself. A cut, maybe deeper than you'd like, maybe your ankle hurts, maybe your wrist doesn't feel quite right anymore. Nothing catastrophic, but not nothing either. And that's the problem. Injury in your situation is not measured by how serious it is. It's measured by how much it slows you down. Because slowing down is dangerous. You're already moving constantly, already avoiding people, terrain, and your own exhaustion. Add even a small injury to that, and suddenly everything becomes harder. Walking takes more effort. Running becomes unreliable. Balance feels uncertain. And uncertainty is not something you can afford. There's no treatment waiting for you. No clean bandages, no proper rest, no reassuring voice telling you it'll heal in a few days. At best, you improvise. Tearing fabric, rinsing wounds with questionable water, hoping infection isn't part of your immediate future. Because infection is worse. Infections don't rush. They don't announce themselves dramatically. They settle in quietly, turning something manageable into something far more serious over time. And time, as you've probably noticed, is not exactly working in your favor. You try to adapt. You move slower, more carefully. You avoid difficult terrain. You choose paths that feel safer, even if they're longer. You tell yourself you can manage this, but your body keeps score. Pain drains energy. Energy affects decisions. Decisions determine survival. And suddenly, the margin for error, already small, becomes almost non-existent. You start to realize something uncomfortable. It was never about avoiding major dangers. It It was about surviving the small ones. Because in this life, you don't need a dramatic ending. You just need one bad step. And as you continue forward, slower now, more aware of every movement, one thought becomes impossible to ignore. You are not built to take damage, and this world doesn't care. Up until now, most of your problems have had a pattern. People can be avoided. Hunger can be managed, badly, but managed. Even injury, if you're careful, can be worked around. The weather, however, does not negotiate. It doesn't care that you're tired. It doesn't care that you're already struggling. It doesn't pause to consider that you've had a difficult 24 hours. It simply changes. At first it's subtle, a shift in the air, a drop in temperature that feels small, almost insignificant. The kind of thing you might have ignored in your previous life. Maybe pulled a cloak tighter. Maybe complained briefly. Then moved on. Now you notice it immediately, because now it matters. The wind picks up. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to make everything colder than it should be. It cuts through your clothing, which, at this point, is already damp, already worn, and doing a very poor job of being clothing. Then the rain begins. Not a gentle poetic drizzle. Not the kind that makes you reflect on life while standing under a roof. No, this is persistent, quietly relentless. The kind of rain that doesn't need to be dramatic because it knows it has time. It soaks everything. Your clothes, your makeshift shelter. The ground beneath you, which was already not ideal, now fully commits to being miserable. Every step becomes heavier. Every attempt to rest becomes colder. There is no dry space, no comfortable position, no moment where you can say, "This is fine," because it isn't. You try to adapt. You look for cover, thicker trees, overhangs, anything that might reduce the exposure. But real shelter is rare, and what you find is usually partial at best. And partial protection is not protection. As the hours pass, the cold settles deeper. Not sharp, not immediate, just slow, steady, and very effective. Your body starts to conserve energy. Movements become slower, fingers lose dexterity. Thoughts become slightly less clear, slightly harder to organize. And that's when it becomes dangerous. Because cold doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it makes you less capable. You begin making small mistakes, choosing the wrong path, misjudging distance, ignoring details you would have noticed before. And in your situation, small mistakes have a habit of becoming large problems very quickly. There's no escaping it. You can't outrun the weather. You can't reason with it. You can't wait it out comfortably, because comfort is no longer something you have access to. All you can do is endure. And as the rain continues, as the cold lingers, as your body struggles to keep up with demands it was never meant to meet, one thought becomes very clear. You were already struggling to survive. Now the environment has decided to participate. By now something has changed. Not outside. That part has been consistently terrible. But inside. At first your problems were physical. Hunger, cold, exhaustion. Things you could point to, measure, complain about internally like a very miserable checklist. Now it's different. Now it's your mind. Because after enough time living like this, fear stops being an occasional reaction. It becomes your default setting. You don't notice when it starts. There's no clear moment where you say, "Ah yes, I am now permanently anxious." It just settles in, quietly, efficiently. Like everything else in this experience, every sound becomes important. A branch snapping isn't just a branch snapping, it's a possibility. Someone moving, something approaching. You turn your head before you even think about it. Your body reacting faster than your logic can catch up. Every shadow becomes suspicious. Shapes shift in your peripheral vision. Movements you're not entirely sure are real. Your eyes start playing tricks, trying to keep up with a world where missing something could be your last mistake. And then there's the silence. Silence used to mean peace. Now it means uncertainty. Too quiet feels wrong. Like something is waiting. Like the world has paused just long enough for something unpleasant to happen. You stop relaxing. Not gradually, completely. Your shoulders stay tense. Your breathing stays shallow. Even when you sit, even when you try to rest, your body refuses to let go. It's always ready, or at least trying to be, because it knows that being unprepared is dangerous. Sleep, if you manage it at all, becomes lighter. You wake up often, sometimes for a reason, sometimes for no reason at all. Your mind doesn't care about logic anymore. It cares about survival, and survival prefers false alarms over missed threats, which means you're tired, constantly, and tired people don't think clearly. That's when the real danger begins, because fear combined with exhaustion starts to distort things. You hesitate when you should move. You move when you should stay hidden. You start reacting instead of deciding, and reacting is unpredictable. You might avoid a harmless situation. You might walk straight into a dangerous one. The line between caution and panic becomes flexible. And in your world, flexibility is not helpful. It's risky. You start to realize something uncomfortable. The world isn't just against you physically, it's wearing you down mentally, slowly, consistently, without pause. And as you sit there, listening to sounds that may or may not matter, watching shadows that may or may not be real, one thought becomes impossible to ignore. You are no longer just trying to survive the world. You are trying to survive your own mind inside it. It was always going to happen. You can only move, hide, and hope for so long before something, or someone, notices. Not because you made a dramatic mistake, but because constant survival leaves very little room for perfection. And perfection is what this life quietly demands. At first it's subtle, a sound that doesn't belong. Not the usual forest noise, not the quiet shifting of leaves or distant movement of animals. This is different, rhythmic, intentional. Footsteps. You freeze, not out of bravery, out of instinct. Your body reacts before your mind catches up, muscles locking, breath held, as if becoming very still will somehow make you invisible. It won't. But you try anyway. The sound gets closer. Not fast, not slow, just steady, confident. The kind of movement that suggests whoever it is isn't lost, isn't wandering. They know where they're going. And unfortunately, that direction seems to include you. Your mind starts working quickly now, though working might be generous. It's more like a frantic collection of half-formed ideas. Run! Hide! Stay still. None of them feel like good options, mostly because they aren't. You shift slightly, just enough to see, and there they are. Maybe it's a villager. Maybe it's more than one. Maybe it's a patrol, which is objectively worse, because that means coordination, purpose, and significantly fewer chances for negotiation. For a moment, everything pauses. They see you. And just like that, the situation changes from possible danger to very real problem. There's no conversation, no attempt to understand your situation. You don't get to explain that this has all been very inconvenient for you. You're an outlaw. That's all they need to know. And then, movement. Fast. Direct. Decisive. You run. Not because you've planned this, not because you're prepared, but because standing still has just officially become the worst possible option. Your body pushes forward, ignoring fatigue, ignoring pain, ignoring the long list of reasons this is not sustainable. Behind you, they follow. You hear it. The increase in pace. The urgency. Voices maybe. Hard to tell over the sound of your own breathing, which is now louder than anything else. The ground feels uneven. Your steps aren't as steady as they should be. Your body is already tired, already strained, and now you're asking it for more, much more. This is where reality sets in. You are not faster. You are not stronger. You are not in better condition. You are simply more desperate. And desperation is not a long-term advantage. You push forward anyway, because there's no alternative. Every second matters. Every step is a chance. Small, fragile, but still a chance. To create distance. But as your lungs burn, as your legs begin to slow despite your efforts, one thought cuts through everything else. You can't do this for long, and neither can your luck. At some point during the running, or more accurately, the collapsing forward with determination, something becomes painfully clear. This isn't working, not in a dramatic, sudden way. There's no moment where you stop, look into the distance, and deliver a thoughtful realization about your limitations. It's quieter than that, more physical. Your legs feel heavier than they should. Your breathing is uneven, too fast, too shallow. Your chest tightens in a way that suggests your body is no longer fully on board with your survival plan. You slow down, not because you want to, because you have to. And that's when it hits you. You're not built for this. You've spent your life inside a system, even if it was harsh. You've eaten regularly. Not well, perhaps, but consistently enough. You've slept in some form of shelter. You've moved through your days without the constant need to run, hide, and calculate risk every second. Your body is not trained for endurance like this. Your mind is not conditioned for pressure like this. And now, both are starting to fail you at the same time. You try to push through it. Everyone does. There's always that moment where you convince yourself that if you just try harder, move faster, ignore the pain a little longer, things will improve. They don't. Because this isn't a short challenge. This is the baseline. You're not sprinting towards safety. You're trying to survive a lifestyle that demands this level of effort constantly. And the energy you're using right now? You don't have enough of it to sustain this for hours, let alone days. Behind you, the threat may still be there. Maybe closer, maybe not. Hard to tell now. Your focus is narrowing. your awareness shrinking as your body prioritizes the most basic functions. Breathe, move, don't collapse. It's not strategic anymore. It's survival in its simplest form. And that's where things start to unravel, because without clarity, without energy, without control, you stop making good decisions. You stop thinking ahead. You react. You stumble. You take paths that feel right instead of paths that are safe. And that difference matters. You might lose them. It's possible. Desperation sometimes creates just enough chaos to break line of sight, to create distance, to give you a temporary escape. But even if you do, you're left with the same problem. You, tired, hungry, slower than before, more aware than ever that this life isn't just dangerous, it's unsustainable. And as you finally stop, leaning against something solid, trying to steady your breathing, one thought settles in with uncomfortable clarity. It's not that you can't survive one moment like this, it's that you can't survive all of them. At some point, usually when you're cold, hungry, and reconsidering every decision that brought you here, your mind does something unhelpful. It remembers stories, the kind where outlaws are clever, skilled, almost admirable, living freely in the wild, outsmarting authority, surviving through wit and courage, the kind of stories where everything somehow works out, where danger is exciting rather than exhausting. Stories like Robin Hood, and for a brief moment, you wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's a version of this life that looks like that. There isn't. Those stories exist for a reason. They take something harsh, unpredictable, and deeply unpleasant, and smooth it into something people can enjoy without feeling too uncomfortable about it. Reality doesn't do that. There's no perfect aim with a bow. In fact, there's no guarantee you'd even have a bow, or arrows, or the time and energy to practice enough to make any of that useful. Skill requires repetition, and repetition requires stability. Two things your current lifestyle has politely removed. There's no loyal band of companions either, no cheerful group sharing food and laughter around a fire, united by a noble cause. The people you meet are surviving, just like you. And survival tends to focus the mind on personal outcomes rather than group harmony. Even the idea of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor sounds far more organized than anything you're capable of right now. You're not redistributing wealth. You're trying to find enough food to continue existing. That's the entire operation. And then there's the freedom. That word gets used a lot in these stories. Freedom from rules. Freedom from authority. Freedom to live as you choose. But what you're experiencing doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like exposure. No protection. No safety. No structure. Every decision carries weight, and every mistake carries consequences. You're not free from responsibility. You're overwhelmed by it. The truth is, the romantic version of this life removes all the parts that make it difficult. The hunger, the fear, the constant movement, the isolation. It replaces them with something cleaner, simpler, easier to admire from a distance. But standing here in the middle of it, there's no distance, just reality. And reality is not interested in making you look heroic. It's interested in seeing whether you can endure. And based on how things are going so far, that's not looking particularly promising. If you were expecting a dramatic ending, a last stand, a final chase, something worthy of a story, this is where expectations and reality politely part ways. Because most outlaws don't end in spectacle, they end in silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that arrives when resistance has quietly run out, when the body has nothing left to offer, and the mind, after days of tension and calculation, simply stops trying to stay ahead of everything at once. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds. Fatigue settles deeper. Hunger stops feeling sharp and becomes dull, constant. Movement slow without you noticing at first. You sit a little longer than you should. You rest in places that aren't as hidden as they need to be. Not because you've given up, because you've run out. And that's when something shifts. Maybe it's the sound of voices again. Not distant this time. Closer. Certain. The kind of certainty that suggests they're not searching anymore. They've found something. Maybe it's someone you trusted. Someone who saw an opportunity and decided survival would be easier without you in the equation. No betrayal speech. No dramatic confrontation. Just a quiet decision, made earlier, now reaching its conclusion. Or maybe it's nothing like that. Maybe you're simply too slow now. Too tired to react in time. Too worn down to move when it matters most. However it happens, the pattern is the same. There's no grand realization. No final burst of strength. No clever escape that turns everything around at the last second. Just a moment where everything narrows. Movement stops. And the situation, which has been unstable from the beginning, finally settles into something definite. Medieval justice doesn't hesitate. It doesn't pause to consider your journey, your struggle, or how close you came to holding things together. It isn't interested in your perspective, it's interested in outcomes. And outcomes, in your case, were always leaning in one direction. Quick, public, final. Not because you were uniquely unlucky or particularly unskilled, but because the system was never designed for you to win. And as everything comes to a close, without spectacle, without ceremony, one thought lingers, not dramatic, just clear. This was never about a single mistake. It was about a situation that gave you no space to recover from any of them. So here you are. Or rather, here you would have been. Because by now it's clear how this story works. Not in a dramatic storybook sense, but in the quiet, methodical way reality tends to operate when no one is trying to make it entertaining. Why wouldn't you last a day as a medieval outlaw? It's not because you're weak. That would be too simple. Too comforting even. It suggests that someone stronger, smarter, or more prepared might succeed where you failed. The truth is less flattering. This life is built to wear you down, every part of it. The law removes your protection. The people remove your support. The environment removes your comfort. And your own body, slowly, inevitably, removes your ability to keep up with all of it at once. There is no single point of failure. It's everything happening together. You don't lose because of one mistake. You lose because you're forced to operate in conditions where mistakes are unavoidable and unforgiving. Hunger clouds your judgment. Exhaustion slows your reactions. Fear distorts your decisions. Injury limits your movement. Each problem feeds the next. And there's no pause button. No safe moment where you can step back, recover, and try again with a clearer head. Everything is continuous. Everything demands attention. Everything takes something from you until there's nothing left to take. And that's the part most stories leave out. Survival isn't about one heroic act. It's about sustaining effort over time, under pressure, without relief. It's about enduring a situation that doesn't improve, doesn't stabilize, and doesn't offer second chances. You were never given the conditions to succeed. You were given the conditions to last, briefly, and maybe that's the real answer. It's not that you wouldn't last a day because you couldn't handle it. It's that no one was meant to handle it for long. This wasn't a lifestyle. It was a countdown. Long before wine carried prestige, before collectors argued over notes of cherry and oak like philosophers debating the nature of truth, wine was simply survival in liquid form. Across the lands that would later become Bordeaux and Burgundy, farmers weren't dreaming of legacy. They were trying to make something drinkable that wouldn't quietly poison them. In the early medieval world, water was often unreliable, sometimes dangerous, and occasionally a fast track to meeting your ancestors. Wine, even poor quality wine, was safer. So grapes were planted not because the soil was perfect or the climate divine, but because vines were stubborn. They could grow where other crops sulked and died. Rocky hillsides, uneven terrain, soils that would insult wheat. Grapes accepted them all with quiet indifference. Back then, no one cared about terroir. That concept, the idea that land itself shapes flavour, had not yet been romanticized into poetry. A vineyard was not a symbol of refinement. It was a tool. The wine produced was often thin, sour, and inconsistent, varying wildly from one year to the next. If it tasted decent, that was considered a small miracle. If it didn't, well, add herbs, dilute it, or pretend it was intentional. But something subtle was happening beneath this chaos. Over time, certain plots of land began to show patterns. One hillside consistently produced slightly better wine. Another yielded something a little richer, a little smoother. No one wrote tasting notes about it, but people noticed. Quietly, practically, without ceremony. In Burgundy, small patches of land started gaining quiet reputations among local communities. Not fame, nothing so dramatic, but recognition. Meanwhile, in Bordeaux, the rivers and trade routes were slowly setting the stage for something bigger, though no one yet realized it. At this stage, there were no grand estates, no noble branding, no whispered legends of vintages, just farmers, soil, weather, and time. But history has a habit of turning small observations into empires, and in this case, it began with a simple, almost accidental realization. Not all land is equal, and once that idea takes root, much like the vines themselves, it tends to grow, whether anyone is ready for it or not. If medieval farmers were the reluctant caretakers of wine, then monks were the ones who turned it into something dangerously close to an art form, though they would have preferred the term divine necessity. Across regions like Burgundy, monastic orders, particularly the Cistercians and the Benedictines, began quietly studying the land. Not in the modern scientific sense, of course, There were no lab coats, no microscopes, and certainly no PowerPoint presentations. Just observation, repetition, and an impressive amount of patience. Wine was essential for religious rituals, especially the Eucharist. So monks needed consistency. And consistency, as it turns out, is a ruthless teacher. You can't rely on divine intervention every harvest season. Eventually, you start taking notes. So they did. Over decades, then centuries, monks began mapping their vineyards with almost obsessive care. They noticed how one slope caught more sunlight, how another retained moisture longer, how certain soils produced grapes with more balance, more depth, more something. They didn't call it terroir yet, but they were laying its foundation like quiet architects of flavour. In Burgundy, this led to the division of land into small, carefully managed plots, what would later become known as climates. Each one had its own personality, its own behaviour, like a stubborn medieval noble who refused to act like the others. Meanwhile, the monks worked tirelessly. They pruned vines with precision, experimented with harvest times, and refined fermentation techniques, all while maintaining vows of silence, which, frankly, must have made complaining about bad wine extremely difficult. Over in Bordeaux, progress was slower, but no less important. The region's connection to trade routes, especially rivers, meant wine could travel. And once wine starts moving, reputations start forming, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. But back in the monasteries, something remarkable was taking shape. For the first time, wine wasn't just being made, it was being understood. Patterns were no longer accidental. They were studied, repeated, and improved. The irony, of course, is hard to miss. While the outside world was busy with wars, politics, and the occasional plague, monks were quietly perfecting one of humanity's most enduring pleasures. Not for fame, not for profit, but because, somewhere between prayer and patience, they realized something profound. Great wine isn't luck, it's discipline, with a hint of divine assistance, just to keep things interesting. For centuries, wine had been improving quietly in monasteries and rural plots, minding its own business like a well-behaved peasant. Then inevitably the powerful noticed. And when kings notice something, it usually stops being simple. In Bordeaux, this turning point arrived not through careful study, but through politics. Specifically, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II. With that union, Bordeaux and its wines were effectively plugged into the English crown's appetite, which, as it turns out, was quite substantial. Suddenly, Bordeaux wasn't just producing wine for locals. It was supplying England. Barrels began moving in large quantities across the sea, and with them came something new. Demand on a scale that medieval farmers had never imagined. And demand changes everything. Wine producers in Bordeaux began focusing less on survival and more on consistency and volume. Ports grew busier, merchants grew richer, and certain areas, those producing more reliable wine, started gaining reputations beyond their immediate surroundings. Not yet the polished prestige we associate with Bordeaux today, but something close to a reputation in its infancy. Meanwhile, in Burgundy, the story unfolded differently. Burgundy lacked Bordeaux's direct access to major trade routes, but it had something arguably more powerful: control and obsession. The Dukes of Burgundy, particularly Philip the Bold, began enforcing strict standards on wine production. In fact, Philip the Bold famously banned the cultivation of Gamay grapes in favour of Pinot Noir, declaring Gamay to be, essentially, the medieval equivalent of cheap fast food. It was a bold move, pun entirely intended, and it forced the region toward quality over quantity. So now you had two emerging philosophies. Bordeaux leaned into trade, scale, and growing international demand. Its wines began travelling farther, reaching courts and merchants who would spread its name. Burgundy, on the other hand, doubled down on precision, refining smaller plots with almost obsessive care, guided by both monastic knowledge and ducal authority. And just like that, wine stopped being merely agricultural. It became political, economic, strategic. A barrel of wine was no longer just a drink. It was influence. It was status. It was a quiet symbol of power poured into a cup. And as history tends to prove, once something becomes power, people will compete for it, relentlessly. By now, wine had escaped its humble origins and wandered straight into the hands of merchants, arguably the most dangerous group in history when it comes to turning everyday goods into global obsessions. In Bordeaux, trade had already begun reshaping the region. Ships carried barrels across the Channel to England, and from there, onward into broader European markets. But merchants didn't just transport wine, they categorized it. priced it, compared it, and most importantly, judged it. And merchants, unlike monks, had no vows of humility. They began to notice differences not just between regions, but within them. Certain estates produced wine that travelled better. Some aged more gracefully. Others arrived tasting like regret sealed in oak. Over time, names started sticking. Not official classifications, not yet, but informal hierarchies whispered in trading houses and scribbled into ledgers. A wine from one part of Bordeaux might fetch a higher price than another. Not because of royal decree, but because merchants trusted it. And trust in commerce is worth more than any crown. Meanwhile, in Burgundy, reputation was being built with far less noise but far more precision. The legacy of monastic mapping continued to influence how vineyards were understood. Small plots, painstakingly observed over generations, began to carry distinct identities. But here's the difference. Burgundy wasn't scaling. It couldn't. Its geography and fragmented land ownership made large-scale production nearly impossible. Instead, it leaned into what it did best, producing wines that were unmistakably tied to their exact origin. If Bordeaux was becoming a brand, Burgundy was becoming a philosophy. Back in the trading world, records grew more detailed. Buyers wanted to know where a wine came from, how reliable it was, whether it justified its cost. Early forms of classification, primitive, inconsistent, and often biased, started taking shape. It wasn't science. It wasn't even fully fair. But it was the beginning of something permanent. Reputation as currency. By the late medieval and early modern periods, wine was no longer anonymous. It had identity. Certain areas were known for quality, others for volume, and some for producing wine that people politely drank while silently reconsidering their life choices. And once identity enters the picture, everything changes. Because now, wine isn't just something you consume. It's something you recognize, something you remember, and more importantly, something you choose. By the time wine had fully embedded itself into trade networks and aristocratic dining halls, something curious happened. People decided it needed structure, not better wine necessarily, just organized superiority. And so began the age of classification. In Bordeaux, this urge reached its peak during the reign of Napoleon III, who, in preparation for the grand spectacle of the Exposition Universelle of 1855, requested a ranking of the region's finest wines. Because nothing says national pride like politely competing bottles of fermented grapes. The result was the famous 1855 classification, a neat hierarchy that sorted Bordeaux wines into growths, from the elite first growths down to the lesser tiers. It was based largely on market prices at the time, which, in fairness, reflected long-standing reputations, and, in less fair terms, reflected who had been good at selling themselves for the past few centuries. Names like Chateau Lafite and Chateau Margaux rose to near-mythical status, their wines now carrying not just flavour, but official recognition. A bottle wasn't just good, it was ranked, approved, and quietly telling you that your taste could now be measured against a list created for a world fair. Meanwhile, in Burgundy, things unfolded with less spectacle and more complexity. Burgundy resisted simple classification, largely because its vineyards were fragmented into countless small plots, each with its own identity. Instead of ranking estates, Burgundy focused on land itself, eventually leading to a system of Grands Crus, Premiers Crus, and village-level wines. It was less tidy, far more confusing, and naturally, far more accurate. Because in Burgundy, two vineyards separated by a narrow path could produce wildly different wines. Trying to simplify that into a single hierarchy would be like ranking siblings based on one family dinner. Possible, but deeply misleading. What's fascinating is how these classifications shaped perception. Once a wine was labelled first growth or Grand Cru, it didn't just describe quality, it reinforced it. Prices rose, demand followed, and suddenly, reputation wasn't just earned through centuries of consistency. It was protected, preserved, and, occasionally, exaggerated. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Some wines remained frozen in their rankings despite changes in quality, while others improved dramatically but struggled to climb the rigid ladder. But by now, wine had fully transformed. It was no longer just agriculture or even just commerce. It was identity, carefully categorized, elegantly marketed, and just structured enough to make people feel like they understood it, even if deep down they didn't. Just when wine regions had finally organized themselves into neat hierarchies, labels polished, reputations secured, egos comfortably inflated, history did what it does best. It intervened. War arrived. repeatedly, enthusiastically. Across Bordeaux and Burgundy, vineyards that had taken centuries to refine were suddenly trampled by armies who, it must be said, had very little interest in preserving delicate grape varieties. Soldiers marched through fields, uprooted vines, and occasionally helped themselves to whatever wine remained, usually without leaving tasting notes behind. The French Revolution added another layer of chaos. Estates once controlled by nobles and the church were seized, divided, and redistributed. In Burgundy especially, this led to extreme fragmentation. Vineyards that had once been managed as unified plots were split among multiple owners, sometimes dozens, each inheriting a narrow slice of land, and with it, a piece of an increasingly complicated legacy. If the goal had been simplicity, it failed spectacularly. Then came disease, because apparently war wasn't enough. In the 19th century, a tiny pest known as phylloxera, essentially a microscopic grapevine assassin, arrived from North America and began destroying European vineyards at a pace that can only be described as impressively devastating. Entire regions were wiped out. Vines with centuries of history collapsed, their roots quietly eaten away beneath the surface. In Bordeaux, production plummeted. In Burgundy, already fragmented vineyards faced even greater instability. Reputation, it turned out, was fragile. It depended on consistency. And consistency is difficult to maintain when your vines are dying and your land is being divided like an awkward inheritance. The solution eventually came in the form of grafting European vines onto resistant American rootstocks. It worked, thankfully, though not without resistance from those who found the idea of foreign roots deeply offensive. Tradition, after all, has never been known for its flexibility. But the damage had been done. Generations of work had to be rebuilt. Knowledge had to be reapplied. And perhaps most importantly, regions had to prove themselves all over again. Because reputation isn't permanent. It survives only if it can endure disruption. War, disease, politics, and the occasional disastrous harvest. And in that sense, the great wine regions weren't just refined. They were tested, relentlessly. After war, revolution, and a vine-killing pest that behaved like it had a personal vendetta against Europe, wine regions faced an uncomfortable reality. Survival alone wasn't enough. They needed protection, not from armies this time, but from imitation. Because once a reputation exists, someone somewhere will try to copy it. Poorly. By the early 20th century, wines labelled as coming from Bordeaux or Burgundy weren't always from Bordeaux or Burgundy. Some were diluted, blended, or entirely fabricated elsewhere, then sold under prestigious names to unsuspecting buyers who trusted the label more than the liquid. Understandable. The label had been behaving very convincingly for centuries, so France responded with something revolutionary. Not wine this time, but law. The creation of the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée system, or AOC, formalized what had long been understood but never strictly enforced, that a wine's identity must be tied to its origin. Not vaguely, not creatively, precisely. Under this system, regions were clearly defined. Boundaries were drawn. Rules were established. What grapes could be used, how they could be grown, how the wine could be produced. It was, in essence, a legal framework designed to protect centuries of accumulated reputation from being casually undermined by opportunistic shortcuts. In Bordeaux, this reinforced existing hierarchies, ensuring that the names attached to prestigious estates remained meaningful. In Burgundy, it brought much-needed clarity to an already complex system of vineyard classifications, anchoring identity firmly to geography. Of course, with rules comes rigidity. Some producers found the regulations restrictive. Innovation had to operate within boundaries. Experimentation became carefully supervised, but the trade-off was clear: authenticity over chaos. And for consumers, this changed everything. A bottle labelled from a specific region now carried a guarantee, not of perfection, but of origin, of method, of adherence to something larger than the individual producer. Wine, once a simple agricultural product, had now become a protected cultural artifact, legally defined, officially recognized, carefully controlled, and perhaps most interesting of all, authenticity itself had become something that needed enforcement. Because in a world where reputation can be copied, forged, and sold, even something as ancient as wine needs paperwork. Just as France finished building a legal fortress around its wine identity, the rest of the world looked at it and thought quite reasonably, we could do that, but elsewhere. Wine, after all, is not exclusive to one country, despite what a particularly confident bottle from Bordeaux might suggest. Grapes grow in many climates, and by the 18th and 19th centuries, European settlers had already carried vines to places like California, Australia, and Chile. At first, these New World wines were not taken seriously. They were seen as distant imitations, functional, perhaps drinkable, but lacking the deep-rooted prestige of regions like Burgundy. After all, how could a vineyard barely a century old compete with land cultivated since the Middle Ages? Confidence, as it turns out, travels quickly. By the 20th century, winemakers in California began experimenting aggressively. Modern techniques, controlled fermentation, scientific precision. They weren't bound by centuries of tradition, which, while romantic, can also be remarkably limiting. They tested grape varieties, refined processes, and focused relentlessly on quality. Then came the moment that quietly shook the old world. In 1976, the Judgment of Paris, a blind tasting held in Paris of all places, placed French wines head-to-head with Californian ones. The result? The Californian wines won. Not symbolically, not politely, decisively. For regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy, this was less a catastrophe and more an uncomfortable realization. Reputation, no matter how historic, could be challenged. And suddenly, wine became global competition. New regions in Argentina, South Africa, and beyond began building their own identities, not by copying France, but by adapting to their own climates, their own soils, their own interpretations of what wine could be. Meanwhile, the old regions didn't collapse. They adapted, quietly, carefully. Tradition remained, but it began to coexist with modern understanding. Better vineyard management, improved technology, and a renewed focus on quality ensured that their reputations weren't just historical artifacts, they were still earned. And that's the strange beauty of it all. Wine regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy were no longer alone at the top. But instead of fading, they became something else entirely. Benchmarks. Not because they were the only great wines, but because they were the first to prove what greatness could look like. After centuries of survival, reinvention, classification, and the occasional existential crisis, the great wine regions arrived at something unexpected. Permanence. Not the kind carved in stone. History rarely grants that, but a softer, more persuasive kind. The kind that lives in memory, in culture, in expectation. Today, names like Bordeaux and Burgundy carry weight far beyond geography. They are no longer just places on a map. They are ideas, signals, shortcuts for trust in a world that has become increasingly complicated, fast, and, occasionally, a little too enthusiastic about marketing. Because here's the quiet truth. Not every bottle from these regions is extraordinary. Some are excellent. Some are merely good. And some politely remind you that even legends have off days. But that doesn't matter as much as one might think. Reputation, once built over centuries, develops a kind of inertia. It moves forward on its own. Consumers approach a bottle from Bordeaux expecting structure, depth, a certain seriousness. They approach Burgundy expecting nuance, elegance, and perhaps a gentle reminder that understanding it fully may take a lifetime. These expectations shape the experience before the wine is even tasted, and this is where myth quietly takes over. Stories of legendary vintages, historic estates, and perfect harvests begin to blur the line between fact and narrative. A vineyard isn't just land, it's heritage. A bottle isn't just wine. It's a continuation of something that started long before the person holding it was even born. Of course, the modern world complicates things. Climate change shifts growing conditions. Global markets fluctuate. New regions continue to rise, producing wines that challenge, surprise, and occasionally outperform the old guard. The idea of fixed superiority becomes harder to defend with absolute certainty, and yet the legacy remains. Because at its core, the story of these regions was never just about wine. It was about observation, patience, adaptation. Centuries of people paying attention to the land beneath their feet, and slowly learning how to work with it rather than against it. That's what endures. Not just the classifications, not just the labels, not even the prestige, but the idea that place matters. That soil, climate, and time can shape something as simple as fermented grapes into something worth remembering. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. Great wine isn't just made, it's grown, alongside history itself. In ancient Rome, tattoos were not chosen. No one sat down, reflected on their life journey, and decided a small symbolic design would really capture their personality. That kind of optimism had not yet been invented. Roman tattoos were imposed. They had a name for it, stigma, and unlike modern interpretations of the word, this wasn't metaphorical, it was painfully literal. A stigma was a mark burned or cut into the skin, filled with ink, and designed to say one thing very clearly to anyone who saw it. This person belongs to someone, or has done something. From the very beginning, tattoos in Rome were tied to power. Not artistic power, not cultural identity, but authority, cold, administrative, and very efficient. If Rome had a problem, it labelled it. And if it labelled it, it made sure the label could not be removed. Slaves were among the most commonly marked. A tattoo could identify their owner, their origin, or simply brand them as property. It saved time, reduced arguments, and removed any illusion of individuality. In a society built on hierarchy, nothing said, "You are at the bottom," quite like ink that you didn't ask for and couldn't escape. Criminals, too, were marked. Thieves, deserters, and those who had offended the system often carried tattoos that described their crimes. Imagine committing a mistake and having it written on your body for the rest of your life. Not as a lesson, but as a warning to others. Subtlety, as you might suspect, was not a Roman priority. Even soldiers weren't entirely spared. Some were tattooed to show loyalty or unit affiliation, though this came with a different tone. In their case, the mark could represent belonging rather than punishment. Still permanent, still unavoidable. Just slightly more honourable, if you're comfortable redefining honour as mandatory ink under authority. What makes this system particularly effective is how visible it was. Rome didn't rely on hidden records or private documentation. It turned the human body into the record. You didn't need to ask questions. You simply looked. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. That was the genius, and the cruelty of it. Because in Rome, identity wasn't always something you carried inside. Sometimes it was carved directly onto you. Because nothing says you are not free quite like being labelled permanently. Slavery in Rome was not subtle. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, a system of ownership. And like any system of ownership, it relied on identification. You could lose a tool, a coin, even a soldier in the chaos of the empire. But a slave? That required a solution. Enter the tattoo. Many slaves were marked with inscriptions that identified them as property. Some bore the name of their owner. Others carried warnings, phrases that essentially translated to, "Hold me, I have run away," just in case they ever tried to test the concept of freedom, which, to be fair, most humans eventually do. The logic was brutally simple. If a slave escaped, the tattoo ensured they could be recognized, returned, and punished. It removed ambiguity. It removed hope. It turned the body itself into evidence. And the placement mattered. These marks were often placed where they could be easily seen, on the forehead, the arms, or other exposed areas. Not hidden, not discreet. Visibility was the point. A tattoo that no one could see defeated its purpose. Rome didn't do subtle branding, it did public statements. Of course, not all slaves were treated the same. Those working in households or skilled roles might avoid visible markings, if their owners valued appearances. But for many others, especially those in labour or punishment roles, the tattoo was unavoidable. It was part of the system, as ordinary as chains or commands. And then there were the mines. Slaves sent to work in mines were often tattooed, not just as property, but as condemned labour. Their marks weren't just identification. They were declarations of fate. You didn't just belong to someone. You belonged to a place you were unlikely to leave. What's striking is how efficient this was. Rome didn't need constant supervision when identity was literally written on the body. A glance was enough. A moment of recognition replaced a conversation. But efficiency has a cost, because once your identity is reduced to a mark, something fixed, visible, and permanent, it stops being something you can change. And in Rome, that was the entire point. You weren't just owned. You were defined. If slavery turned tattoos into ownership, crime turned them into memory. Permanent, inconvenient memory. In ancient Rome, punishment wasn't always about pain in the moment. It was about extending that punishment indefinitely, long after the sentence had technically ended. And few methods achieved that better than tattooing. Criminals, particularly those guilty of theft, desertion, or repeated offences, were often marked with tattoos that identified their crimes. Not poetically, not vaguely, directly. If you stole, your body might say so. If you ran from military duty, that too could be written into your skin like a very unflattering biography. The goal was simple: deterrence. A public reminder that wrongdoing didn't just bring consequences, it followed you, everywhere. Into markets, into streets, into every interaction where someone might glance at you and immediately know more than you would prefer to share. And unlike imprisonment, which eventually ends, or fines which can be paid, tattoos stayed. They didn't fade with time or good behaviour. Rome wasn't particularly interested in second chances if the first one had already gone poorly. Deserters, especially, were treated with a kind of administrative frustration that translated into very visible punishment. The Roman military relied heavily on discipline, and nothing disrupted that more than soldiers deciding they would rather not participate in organized violence. So deserters were marked, sometimes on the face, to ensure they could be identified instantly. Imagine trying to reintegrate into society with your worst decision permanently displayed. No explanations needed, no benefit of the doubt, just a mark. And then there were prisoners condemned to labor, mines, quarries, places where survival was already uncertain. Their tattoos didn't just label them as criminals, they labeled them as expendable. The kind of people society had decided could be used until they were no longer useful. It's easy to assume the system was purely cruel, and it was, but it was also incredibly efficient. Rome didn't rely on paperwork or records that could be lost or forged. It relied on something far more reliable, the human body as documentation. You didn't need to ask what someone had done. You could read it, and once read, it shaped everything that followed. Because in Rome, punishment wasn't just about what happened to you, it was about what stayed with you forever. If slaves were marked to show ownership and criminals to display guilt, then soldiers in ancient Rome occupied a strange middle ground. They were not owned in the same way slaves were. They were not being punished, at least not officially, and yet they were still marked. Because in Rome, loyalty was not assumed, it was enforced. Roman soldiers were the backbone of the empire. Discipline, order, and obedience were not optional qualities. They were the entire system. And while armor, training, and strict hierarchy kept most men in line, there was always the lingering concern that someone might decide to leave, or worse, switch sides. So Rome did what Rome always did. It marked them. Some soldiers were tattooed, often on the hands or arms, with symbols or letters identifying their unit or allegiance. These marks acted as proof of belonging. If captured, they revealed who you were. If you tried to disappear, they made sure you couldn't do so quietly. It was not exactly a badge of honor, but it wasn't entirely a punishment either. That's what makes it unsettling. Unlike the marks on slaves or criminals, which clearly declared inferiority or guilt, a soldier's tattoo could be interpreted as a sign of commitment, a physical reminder that you were part of something larger, something powerful, something that, ideally, would not collapse the moment you looked away. Of course, there was another side to this. A tattoo that proves loyalty can also expose disloyalty. If a soldier deserted, that same mark became evidence. It didn't matter how far you ran, how well you hid, or how convincingly you claimed to be someone else. The empire had already written your identity into your skin, quietly, permanently, effectively, and this blurred the line between pride and control. Was the tattoo a symbol of belonging, or was it a precaution against betrayal? The answer, unsurprisingly, was both. Rome didn't waste opportunities. If something could serve multiple purposes, reinforcing unity while preventing escape, it was considered efficient. And efficiency, as we've seen, was a Roman obsession. So soldiers carried their identity with them at all times, not in documents, not in records, on their bodies, which meant that even in moments of doubt, even in the chaos of war or the temptation of desertion, there was always a reminder, right there, you belong, and leaving will not be easy. If tattoos marked slaves as property and soldiers as controlled loyalty, then for prisoners in ancient Rome, they marked something far darker, finality. Not always death, but something close enough to make the distinction feel unnecessary. Rome had a category of punishment reserved for those it considered expendable. Criminals sent to mines, quarries, or forced labor camps. These were not places designed for reform. They were designed for extraction, of labor, of resources, and eventually of life itself. And before you were sent there, Rome made sure you were labelled accordingly. These prisoners were often tattooed or branded in ways that made their status immediately clear. Not just criminals, not just offenders, but condemned labour. The kind of people society had decided would not be returning to normal life. The marks were deliberate, visible, unmistakable. Because unlike a prison sentence that could, in theory, end, this was different. Even if a prisoner escaped, and survival alone would already be a small miracle, the tattoo ensured that their past followed them. There was no quiet reintegration, no fresh start, no moment where you could convincingly say, that was a different time. Rome didn't believe in that kind of optimism. In mining regions, where conditions were brutal and life expectancy was short, these tattoos also served a practical purpose. They identified workers quickly, sorted them efficiently, and removed any ambiguity about who belonged where. It was administration reduced to its most efficient and most merciless form. You didn't need records. You didn't need explanations. You just needed to look, and what you saw told you everything. There's something particularly chilling about this system. Not just the physical suffering, which was severe, but the psychological weight of it. A mark that tells you, and everyone else, that your role is fixed. That your future has already been decided. No negotiation, no appeal. Just a slow, grinding certainty. And yet, from Rome's perspective, this was simply order. A way to manage an empire that stretched across continents, filled with millions of people, each requiring categorization, control, and, when necessary, disposal. Harsh, yes, but effective. Because in a system like that, identity wasn't something you discovered over time. It was assigned. And once assigned, it rarely changed. Tattoos did not originate in ancient Rome. Like many things the Romans later perfected, or weaponized, they borrowed the idea from others. Beyond Rome's borders, tattoos carried very different meanings. Among various tribes, especially those the Romans grouped under the convenient label of barbarians, tattoos were symbols of identity, status, courage, even beauty. Warriors marked their bodies with patterns that told stories of battles fought, families honored, gods respected. To Rome, this was deeply suspicious, partly because it was unfamiliar, mostly because it was uncontrolled. Groups like the Picts, whose very name may derive from their painted or tattooed bodies, embodied everything Rome found both fascinating and unsettling. Their skin was not a tool of authority imposed from above. It was a canvas of self-expression, tribal belonging, and cultural pride. Naturally, Rome disapproved. Roman culture placed enormous value on order, hierarchy, and clear distinctions between classes. A free Roman citizen was expected to present a certain image. Disciplined, controlled, and importantly, unmarked. Visible tattoos disrupted that image. They blurred the lines between citizen and slave, between Roman and foreigner, and Rome did not enjoy blurred lines. This created an interesting contradiction. On one hand, Rome used tattoos extensively as tools of control, branding slaves, marking criminals, labeling soldiers. On the other hand, it rejected tattoos as something un-Roman when they appeared as voluntary decoration. The difference was not the ink, it was the authority behind it. A tattoo forced upon you reinforced Rome's power. A tattoo chosen by you suggested independence. And independence, particularly among subject peoples, was not a quality the empire encouraged. As Rome expanded into regions like Britannia, it encountered more cultures where body marking was normalized. Some soldiers and travelers inevitably absorbed these influences. Small traces of foreign customs began to seep into the edges of Roman life, despite official attitudes. But the core perspective remained firm. Tattoos were acceptable only when they served the system. Anything outside that, anything personal, expressive, or culturally autonomous, was seen as primitive, even threatening. Not because it was inherently dangerous, but because it existed beyond Rome's control. And that, more than anything, was the real issue. Because an empire can tolerate many things, but a symbol it didn't create and couldn't regulate. That was far more difficult to accept. Over time, something subtle but important shifted in ancient Rome. Tattoos did not disappear, but their meaning hardened. What had already been associated with punishment and control slowly became something worse, a visible symbol of disgrace. By the later imperial period, a clear cultural divide had formed. A free Roman citizen, particularly one of status, was expected to have unmarked skin, clean, untouched, and, in a sense, civilized. Tattoos, by contrast, became strongly associated with those at the bottom of society. Slaves, criminals, prisoners. It wasn't just about function anymore. It was about identity. Writers and thinkers like Seneca the Younger reflected the broader Roman discomfort with bodily marks. While not always discussing tattoos directly, Roman philosophy emphasized self-control, dignity, and order, qualities that didn't quite align with the idea of having your body permanently altered, especially by force. And then came a major transformation. As Christianity began to spread through the empire, eventually gaining imperial support under figures like Constantine the Great, attitudes toward the human body started to change. The body was increasingly viewed as something sacred, something created in the image of God. Marking it, especially the face, became controversial. There were even edicts discouraging or restricting certain types of tattooing, particularly on the face, as it was seen as disrespectful to the divine image. The irony, of course, is difficult to ignore. A system that had spent centuries marking bodies for control was now reconsidering the practice on moral grounds, not entirely abandoning it, but certainly reframing it. At the same time, tattoos became more deeply tied to shame. A mark was no longer just a practical label. It was a visible sign that you did not belong to the respectable world. That something about you, your status, your past, your role, placed you outside the ideal Roman identity. And once that association takes hold, it tends to stick. Because shame, unlike punishment, doesn't require enforcement. It enforces itself. So by the later stages of the empire, tattoos had lost any ambiguous meaning they might have once held. They were no longer neutral tools or occasional symbols of loyalty. They were warnings, not just about who you were, but about who you were not allowed to be. By now, tattoos in ancient Rome had become a system, organized, intentional, and deeply embedded in how the empire managed people. But like most systems built on control, it worked best on paper. In reality, people are inconvenient. Marks could identify, label, and restrict, but they couldn't completely eliminate resistance. And resistance, even in small, quiet forms, still existed. Escaped slaves, for example, didn't simply accept their fate because ink said so. Some attempted to alter or hide their tattoos. Scars were disguised, marks were damaged, and in rare cases, individuals tried to reshape their identity despite what had been written on their skin. It was risky, often unsuccessful, but it reveals something important. A mark can define you socially. It cannot fully control what you choose to do next. There were also cases where tattoos created unintended consequences. A mark designed to isolate someone could also unite others. Slaves, prisoners, or laborers sharing similar markings might recognize each other, forming small, fragile networks of shared experience. Not organized rebellion. Rome was very good at preventing that, but quiet understanding. A look, a recognition, a shared reality. And sometimes that was enough to remind someone they weren't entirely alone. Even among soldiers, the system had its limits. A tattoo might prove loyalty on the surface, but it couldn't guarantee it underneath. A marked soldier could still doubt, hesitate, or even defect if circumstances pushed him far enough. The body carried the empire's label, but the mind remained less predictable, which is, historically speaking, always where things get complicated. Over time, as Rome expanded and its population became more diverse, enforcing a single rigid system of identity grew increasingly difficult. Cultural differences, regional variations, and sheer scale made uniform control more of an ideal than a reality. Tattoos remained effective, but not absolute. And that's the key distinction, because systems like this rely on the assumption that identity can be fixed, that once something is labelled, it stays that way. But human behaviour rarely cooperates so neatly. People adapt, they resist. They find ways, small, imperfect, sometimes desperate ways, to push back against what has been imposed on them, even when that imposition is permanent. So, while Rome could mark the body with remarkable efficiency, it never fully mastered what it actually wanted: complete control. And history tends to remember those limits just as much as the system itself. When ancient Rome began its slow collapse, many of its systems faded with it. Laws rewritten, armies dissolved, cities reshaped. But some ideas didn't disappear so easily. Tattoos were one of them, not in the sense that Rome's exact practices continued unchanged, but in the deeper way they had been understood. The association between tattoos and control, punishment, and social stigma lingered long after the empire itself had fractured. Early medieval societies inherited more than just Roman roads and ruins. They inherited its attitudes. For centuries, in much of Europe, tattoos remained something viewed with suspicion. Marked skin often implied a marked past. A person carrying visible ink might be assumed to have been punished, owned, or somehow set apart from the respectable order of society. The Roman idea had settled in quietly and refused to leave. And yet, outside this influence, tattoos continued to exist in entirely different forms. In other parts of the world, body marking remained cultural, symbolic, even sacred. It represented identity, lineage, protection, belonging, almost the complete opposite of what it had meant in Rome. The contrast is striking. The same act, marking the skin, could signify either pride or shame, depending entirely on who held the authority to define it, which unsurprisingly brings us back to Rome, because what the empire really left behind wasn't just a practice, it was a framework, a way of thinking about the body as something that could be used to display status, enforce rules, and communicate identity without words, a visible system, immediate, unavoidable. Modern perspectives have shifted, of course. Tattoos today are often chosen, designed, and embraced as personal expression, but the old associations haven't entirely vanished. There is still, in some corners of society, a lingering instinct to judge, to assume, to read meaning into marks on the skin, a faint echo of something much older, something Roman, And that's the strange legacy of it all. What began as a tool of control, used to label slaves, punish criminals, and enforce loyalty, did not simply disappear with the empire that created it. It adapted, spread, and transformed, shaped by different cultures and different values. But underneath it all, one idea remained, that the human body could carry a message, not spoken, not written on parchment, but written directly into the skin, and once written, remembered. In Edo period, opium existed, but in a strangely restrained, almost reluctant way. This was not Qing dynasty China, where opium would later seep into every layer of society, quietly turning trade into dependency and habit into crisis. In Japan, the same substance crossed the sea. And then, for reasons that feel almost suspiciously disciplined, never quite took hold. It arrived through trade, not openly, not dramatically, but in small, controlled quantities via the port of Nagasaki, Japan's carefully monitored gateway to the outside world. During this period, foreign interaction was tightly restricted under the policies of the Tokugawa shogunate, which had perfected the art of saying yes, but only a little, to global influence. Opium came along with medicines, textiles, and knowledge, just another foreign import, at least on the surface. But unlike other goods, it carried a different kind of potential. In other parts of Asia, opium had already begun shifting from medical use to recreational consumption. It had the ability to calm, to sedate, to quietly alter reality in a way that people tend to find appealing. Historically speaking, substances that make life feel easier rarely struggle to find an audience. And yet, in Japan, something unusual happened. It didn't spread. This wasn't because people were somehow immune to its effects. The human brain, regardless of geography, is remarkably consistent in what it enjoys. The difference lay elsewhere. In structure, in control, in a system that filtered what entered society and how far it was allowed to go. The Tokugawa government didn't necessarily ban opium outright in the beginning. Instead, it controlled the channels through which it could move. Trade was limited, distribution was restricted, and most importantly, there was no open environment where opium could quietly expand into daily life. It remained contained, used in some cases as medicine, known, certainly, but not normalized. And that distinction between something existing and something spreading is more important than it might seem, because history is full of substances that arrived in a place and transformed it completely. Opium, in Edo Japan, did something far less dramatic. It arrived. It lingered. And then, under the weight of careful control and cultural resistance, it stayed on the edges. Because it stayed on the edges, opium in Edo period settled into a role that felt almost respectable. It was medicine, not a vice, not a social habit, not something you casually passed around in dimly lit rooms while contemplating your life choices. Instead, opium was treated as a substance with purpose, measured, applied, and, ideally, kept under control. Japanese medical knowledge during this period drew heavily from Chinese traditions, particularly traditional Chinese medicine. Within that framework, opium had long been recognized for its ability to relieve pain, calm the body, and treat certain conditions when used carefully. It wasn't mysterious. It wasn't exotic. It was known. And more importantly, it was categorized. And once something is categorized in a structured society, it tends to stay in its assigned place. Physicians and herbal practitioners used opium in small quantities, often mixed into remedies rather than consumed on its own. It might be prescribed for severe pain, digestive issues, or conditions that required sedation. But the key detail here is dosage. Always controlled, always deliberate. Unlike in places where opium gradually slipped into recreational use, Edo Japan maintained a clear boundary between medicine and indulgence. The idea of using it purely for pleasure didn't gain traction, not because people lacked curiosity, but because the systems around them didn't encourage that kind of experimentation. Medical practice itself was regulated, both formally and socially. Knowledge was passed through established channels, and remedies were expected to follow recognized traditions. There wasn't much room for improvisation, especially when it came to potent substances. And opium was without question potent. Its effects were understood well enough to respect them, perhaps not in a modern scientific sense, but in a practical one. Too much could overwhelm the body. Too frequent use could lead to dependence. These weren't abstract risks. They were observed realities in neighboring regions. So caution became part of the culture. Even availability played a role. Because opium entered Japan in limited quantities through controlled trade routes, it never became widely accessible. You couldn't simply decide to start using it regularly unless you had the means, the connections, and a very specific reason. And without easy access, habits struggle to form. What's interesting is how ordinary this made opium seem within its proper context. It wasn't feared, but it wasn't embraced either. It existed as a tool, useful, sometimes necessary, but never allowed to drift into something uncontrolled. And that quiet restraint would shape everything that followed. That sense of restraint didn't happen by accident. It was engineered, quietly, methodically, by the system that governed Edo period. At the center of it all stood the Tokugawa shogunate, a regime that had perfected the art of controlled openness. Japan was not completely cut off from the world, despite its reputation. It simply decided exactly how much of the world it was willing to tolerate. And the answer was, not much. Foreign trade was funneled through a single, heavily monitored location, Nagasaki, and more specifically, the artificial island of Dejima. Here, Dutch merchants and a limited number of Chinese traders were allowed to conduct business under strict supervision. Movement was restricted, interactions were controlled, and goods were inspected. Nothing entered freely. Opium, naturally, was included in this system. It did not flow into Japan through open markets or informal networks. It arrived in small, regulated quantities, subject to scrutiny before it ever reached local hands. This alone made widespread use difficult. You can't have a societal problem with something that barely circulates, but control went deeper than logistics. The Tokugawa government was deeply concerned with stability, social, political, and economic. Anything that threatened that balance even indirectly was treated with caution. Substances that could alter behavior, disrupt productivity, or weaken discipline were not exactly encouraged. And opium, if left unchecked, had the potential to do all three. Officials may not have fully understood its long-term effects in a modern sense, but they didn't need to. Observing neighbouring regions, especially China, offered enough of a warning. When a substance begins to influence large populations, it stops being just a personal matter. It becomes a structural problem. So Japan avoided that problem by limiting exposure before it could expand. Trade remained restricted, distribution stayed narrow, and without a large supply, there was no opportunity for demand to grow into something uncontrollable. It was a quiet strategy. No dramatic bans, no widespread panic, just boundaries. And those boundaries worked. Because while other regions struggled to contain opium once it had spread, Edo Japan managed something far simpler and far more effective. It never let it spread in the first place. Control through trade explains how opium was limited. Culture explains why it never truly tempted the masses. In Edo period, daily life was shaped by a rigid social order. Samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants, each with expectations that were not merely suggested, but quietly enforced. Behaviour mattered, reputation mattered more, and self-control was not an admirable trait. It was a requirement. Within that framework, substances that disrupted discipline struggled to find a comfortable place. Alcohol, for example, already occupied the role of controlled indulgence. Sake was widely consumed, socially accepted, and deeply embedded in ritual and daily life. It provided release, celebration, and occasional regret, all within boundaries society understood. There was simply no cultural gap waiting to be filled. Opium, by contrast, offered something different. Not social bonding, not ritual, but inward escape, and that was less compatible. The dominant ethical influences of the time, particularly Confucianism and aspects of Zen Buddhism, placed value on clarity of mind, duty, and awareness. Even pleasure, when it existed, was expected to remain within limits. Excess was not just frowned upon. It was seen as a failure of character. So, while opium might have been known, it didn't align with the ideals people were expected to live by. That doesn't mean no one used it recreationally. Human curiosity has a long and consistent track record. But without cultural reinforcement, without spaces, rituals, or social acceptance, those experiments rarely grew into habits. Because habits need environments. They need repetition, normalization, and a sense that what you're doing fits within the world around you. Opium had none of that. It remained isolated, medically understood, occasionally encountered, but never woven into the fabric of everyday life. Even in urban centers like Edo, where entertainment districts thrived and pleasure culture existed, opium did not establish a visible presence. Other forms of escape, tea houses, theatre, companionship, were already available, already accepted, and, importantly, already controlled. Opium offered something quieter, more internal, less visible, and in a society built on visibility and order, that made it unnecessary, which may be the simplest explanation of all. It wasn't that opium was completely rejected, it just never became needed. And in history, that's often the difference between something existing and something spreading. Even as opium remained contained within Edo period, there was a constant, uncomfortable reminder of what could happen if it didn't. That reminder was China. By the 18th and 19th centuries, opium use in the Qing dynasty had expanded dramatically. What began as controlled medicinal use gradually shifted into widespread recreational consumption. Trade increased, supply grew, and before long, the substance had embedded itself into daily life across multiple social classes. And once that happened, reversing it proved difficult. For observers in Japan, scholars, officials, and those involved in limited foreign trade, this was not distant news. Information flowed through channels like Dejima, where Chinese merchants and intermediaries interacted with Japanese authorities. Reports, observations, and first-hand accounts painted a picture that was hard to ignore. Opium was no longer just a medicine. It was a problem. Dependence spread quietly at first, then visibly. Economic consequences followed, as silver flowed outward to pay for increasing imports. Social concerns grew as productivity declined and discipline weakened, and eventually it became a geopolitical issue, drawing in foreign powers and leading to conflicts that would reshape the region. From Japan's perspective, this was less a mystery and more a warning. A very clear one. The contrast was striking. Two neighbouring cultures, both aware of opium, both capable of using it, yet experiencing entirely different outcomes. One had allowed it to circulate widely. The other had kept it contained. And that difference was not accidental. Japanese officials didn't necessarily need detailed scientific analysis to understand what they were seeing. The consequences were visible enough. A substance that could undermine stability, drain resources, and weaken social order was not something to be casually integrated. So policies remained firm. Trade stayed restricted. Distribution stayed limited. And perhaps most importantly, there was no effort to normalize or expand its use within society. Where China had gradually absorbed opium into its economic and social systems, Japan maintained distance. Deliberate distance. It's tempting to see this as foresight, though at the time it may have felt more like caution shaped by observation. Either way, the result was the same. Opium never gained the momentum it needed to spread, because sometimes the most effective policy isn't invention or innovation, it's simply paying attention to someone else's mistake. Despite tight control and cultural resistance, opium in Edo period was not completely invisible. It existed in small circles, quietly, cautiously, mostly among those who had access to foreign goods and ideas, and that usually meant merchants. Trade, even when restricted, creates curiosity. Items arriving through Nagasaki and the controlled hub of Dejima did more than supply markets. They introduced possibilities. New substances, new tools, new habits. Most were absorbed selectively. Some were ignored. And a few, like opium, were approached with cautious interest. Certain merchants, physicians, and individuals connected to trade networks would have encountered opium more directly than the average person. They understood its effects, its value, and its potential uses. In these limited environments, small-scale experimentation likely occurred, quietly, without spectacle, without the kind of social reinforcement that turns experimentation into habit. That distinction matters, because for a substance to spread, it needs more than availability. It needs a social structure, places where people gather, repeat behavior, and normalize it. In other regions, opium dens or communal smoking practices provided exactly that. They turned a substance into a shared experience. Edo Japan never developed those spaces. There were no widespread opium houses, no established rituals built around its consumption, no environments where its use could quietly expand from a few individuals to entire communities. Without that infrastructure, usage remained isolated, contained within small, often discrete circles. Even within those circles, caution persisted. Opium was not treated lightly. Its strength was understood, even if not fully explained in modern terms. Overuse could be dangerous. Dependence, while perhaps not formally studied, was likely observed. And in a society already structured around discipline, that risk was enough to discourage casual adoption. Merchants, in particular, operated within systems of reputation and reliability. Their success depended on trust, consistency, and control. A habit that could undermine judgment or performance was not exactly a strategic advantage. So while curiosity existed, it rarely translated into widespread use. Opium remained what it had always been in Japan, present but peripheral, known but not embraced. And that quiet limitation, less dramatic than prohibition, but far more effective, kept it from crossing the invisible line between controlled substance and cultural habit. By this stage, opium in Edo period had settled into a predictable pattern: present, controlled, and, most importantly, not expanding. What's striking is how the authorities handled it. There was no dramatic crackdown, no sweeping moral campaign, no public panic about a growing crisis, because quite simply there wasn't one. Instead, the Tokugawa shogunate relied on something far more effective than reaction: prevention. The government already controlled trade, movement, and social structure with remarkable precision. Opium didn't require a special system. It was absorbed into existing controls. Imports were monitored. Distribution remained limited. And without large-scale circulation, there was no urgent need for aggressive enforcement. It's almost disappointingly calm. In other regions, substances like opium forced governments into crisis mode. Late responses, failed restrictions, and attempts to reverse habits that had already taken root. In Japan, the situation never escalated to that point, because the system never allowed it to. There were, of course, regulations. Certain imports were restricted. Medical use remained within controlled frameworks, and any signs of misuse could be addressed locally, without turning into a broader societal issue. But these measures were quiet, administrative, routine, and that's the key difference. Opium wasn't treated as a moral catastrophe. It was treated as a managed variable, something to be watched, contained, and, if necessary, adjusted. No urgency, no overreaction, just control. This approach reflects a broader pattern in Edo governance. Stability was the priority. Anything that threatened it, whether political unrest, economic imbalance, or potentially disruptive substances, was handled before it could grow, not after. And because opium never reached critical mass, it never triggered the kind of response seen elsewhere. There were no widespread bans driven by crisis, no desperate attempts to undo damage. There was simply maintenance, a system functioning as intended, which, from a historical perspective, is almost unusual, because most societies don't deal with emerging problems this early or this effectively. They wait, they react, they struggle to catch up. Edo Japan didn't. It controlled the conditions, and by controlling the conditions, it controlled the outcome. Opium didn't fail to spread by accident. It was quietly prevented from ever having the chance. For centuries, the system held. Opium in Edo period remained controlled, contained, and largely irrelevant to everyday life. The boundaries worked. The structure held. And for a time, it must have seemed like this careful balance could continue indefinitely. History, unfortunately, has very little interest in stability that lasts forever. By the mid-19th century, external pressure began to mount. Western powers, armed with industrial strength, naval superiority, and a very strong belief in opening markets, turned their attention toward Japan. Isolation, which had protected the country for so long, was no longer sustainable. Then came Commodore Matthew Perry. In 1853, Perry arrived with American warships, politely requesting, through the subtle language of cannons, that Japan open its ports to foreign trade. The result was the gradual end of the isolationist system that had defined the Tokugawa era. And with that, the carefully controlled flow of goods changed. Trade expanded, foreign presence increased, and substances that had once been tightly regulated now entered through broader channels. Opium, already circulating heavily in nearby regions like Qing dynasty China, became part of a larger, more complex global exchange. For the first time, Japan faced the same pressures that had affected others. But here's where things diverge. Unlike China, which had already experienced widespread opium use and struggled to contain it, leading to conflicts like the Opium Wars, Japan encountered this expansion from a different position. It had no entrenched culture of opium consumption, no large-scale dependency, no established networks built around the substance. So while exposure increased, the foundation for rapid spread simply wasn't there. At the same time, Japan began transitioning into a new political and social structure with the Meiji Restoration. This shift brought modernization, centralization, and a renewed focus on national strength. And substances that could weaken that strength were viewed with suspicion. Regulation tightened again, this time in a more modern, formalized way. Laws evolved, enforcement adapted, and opium, despite increased global circulation, remained controlled, not invisible, but still limited. Which is, in many ways, remarkable, because by the time Japan fully opened to the world, it was stepping into an environment where opium had already proven its ability to spread rapidly and destructively. And yet it didn't, not because the substance had changed, but because the conditions still hadn't. By the end of it all, the question becomes almost unavoidable. Why didn't opium take hold in Edo period the way it did elsewhere? Because the substance itself was no different. The trade routes existed. The knowledge was there. The human tendency toward escape, comfort, and quiet dependence certainly hadn't disappeared. And yet, nothing happened. Or more precisely, nothing escalated. The answer isn't found in a single policy or moment, but in a combination of conditions that, taken together, created resistance before the problem could form. Control came first. The Tokugawa shogunate restricted trade so tightly that opium never became widely available. Limited supply meant limited exposure, and without exposure, there was no momentum. Culture reinforced that control. A society shaped by hierarchy, discipline, and expectations of restraint did not easily absorb substances that encouraged withdrawal from duty or clarity. Opium didn't fit into existing habits, and without a cultural role, it remained peripheral. Observation played its part as well. Watching the effects of opium in nearby regions, especially Qing dynasty China, provided a clear example of what unchecked spread could look like. It wasn't theoretical. It was visible. And then there was structure. Japan didn't wait for a crisis to act. It prevented the conditions that create one. No open markets. No social spaces built around consumption. No normalization. Without those elements, a substance, even a powerful one, struggles to move beyond isolated use. When the country eventually opened to the world during the Meiji Restoration, it did so without the burden of widespread opium dependence. That alone set it apart from other regions facing the same global pressures. What's left is not a story of prohibition or dramatic resistance. It's something quieter, more controlled. Opium in Japan was never fully rejected. It was understood, limited, and contained. It existed, but never expanded into something larger. And that distinction is the entire story, because history often remembers the rise of powerful forces, the substances, ideas, or movements that reshape societies. But sometimes what matters just as much is what doesn't rise. What arrives, lingers briefly, and then remains on the margins, not through chance, but through structure, discipline, and a system that never allowed it to become anything more.